The Concorde program marked the first major effort to build a supersonic airliner. But years before Concorde, there was already substantial interest in developing supersonic transports. By 1961, both Britain and France had developed concepts for supersonic airliners. Despite some similarities, each had a different idea about what a supersonic airliner should be. The French were aiming to build a medium-range jet, while the British were intent on long-range. For the French, medium-range made sense. Many of Air France's European and North African routes were less than 3,000 kilometers, and the success of their Caravelle proved the utility of fast, medium-range jetliners. The French were also convinced that the Americans would soon introduce their own supersonic transport, and it would undoubtedly be long-range. So the decision to go medium-range would mean avoiding direct competition with American giants like Boeing and Douglas. But the British were convinced that the French had it all wrong, because the true advantages of supersonic flight would only be realized on long-distance routes, where cutting flight times in half would mean cutting hours off each flight. Both countries were eager to cooperate, but neither was willing to budge on range. So when the Concorde Agreement was finally hammered out in 1962, it included a compromise. There would be two versions of Concorde, one medium range and another long range, and the Concorde Treaty emphasized that both versions were to be given equal priority in development. Sharing the same engines and airframe, the medium-range Concorde would be optimized to carry more passengers, while the long-range version would trade passenger capacity for more fuel. It seemed like a sensible solution. But the decision only added complexity to an already ambitious project, and each version turned out to be a compromise of the other, ensuring that neither was truly optimized for its intended role. And when it became clear that sonic booms would make overland supersonic flights virtually impossible, the medium-range version had to be scrapped. But by this point, so did the long-range version, as it simply carried too few passengers to really be successful on long-range routes. So engineers were forced back to the drawing board to come up with a new, larger design that could carry more passengers. But precious development time had been wasted, and it was only in 1965 when specifications were finalized and construction of the first prototypes was ready to begin. When the Concorde program was announced in 1962, the world's leading airlines rushed in to place non-binding options to purchase the world's first supersonic airliner. Many airlines did so largely out of fear of being left behind in the upcoming age of supersonic air travel. In reality, these airlines only had a vague idea about what kind of plane they were actually ordering. But there was little risk in placing a non-binding option. Airlines were free to back out at any time. Even so, by 1967, new orders had ground to a halt, as the plane's ever-increasing purchase price and projected operating costs were coming to light. And Concorde's order book, filled with non-binding options, looked a lot like a house of cards that could blow over at any moment. By 1972, the sales team was desperate to drum up new interest, so they set out on an ambitious sales tour. Using a pre-production prototype, they would fly over 70,000 kilometers to visit prospective buyers in 12 different countries.
Even though one's taking some risks, I suppose, with a prototype, flying it this far away from base.
Well, this I think is you asked Brian Shropshire about the risks we're taking.
But taking a prototype on tour likely did more harm than good. Concorde's Olympus turbojets were still under development, and they were even smokier and louder than they were supposed to be. Something curious onlookers couldn't help but notice. After an enormous effort, the sales team returned home with only a small victory in hand: a new order from Iran to buy 2 Concordes. Although Iran's order was likely motivated to gain political favors from France, it was a sliver of hope for the struggling program. But just 6 months later, the house of cards finally blew over. Pan Am dropped its options to order Concordes. As the world's trend-setting airline, Pan Am's rejection sent a powerful signal. And that same day, TWA management also announced their own plans to drop Concorde, setting off a chain reaction of rejections from other airlines. In just a matter of months, the prospect of a new era of mass supersonic air travel had all but disappeared. In 1976, just as Concorde was entering service, plans were underway to develop a significantly improved second-generation Concorde. Version B, as it would be known, would have greater efficiency and range while producing a lot less noise, improvements that would make the plane more appealing to airlines. Concorde's delta wing set it apart from any airliner before or since. At first glance, it looks remarkably simple, with only 3 elevons to control pitch and roll. In comparison, wings on a subsonic airliner can have dozens of control surfaces. Yet Concorde could fly at both high and low speeds without the use of flaps or slats, a necessary compromise to make supersonic flight possible. Instead, Concorde's delta wing harnessed a phenomenon called vortex lift. At low speeds, Concorde flew at a very high angle of attack to produce vortices on the upper surfaces of the wing, which helped generate more lift. But flying at a high angle of attack requires greater thrust from the engines, which in turn increases fuel consumption and noise. Concorde B would introduce a new wing design, adding leading-edge droop slats to increase lift at low speeds. This would reduce the angle of attack required, and therefore the amount of engine thrust needed. The wings on Concorde B would also be lengthened to help reduce additional low-speed lift and less drag at supersonic speeds. But even more significant improvements were to come from the engines. Concorde's 4 Olympus turbojets generated 128,000 pounds of thrust, still not quite enough to get airborne on a standard-length runway. So Concorde relied on fuel-thirsty afterburners to boost power by an additional 20%. The afterburners would also be used to push the aircraft past Mach 1. On takeoff, Concorde's engines burned an astounding 32 liters per second. But Concorde B would feature an improved version of the Olympus engine, offering increases in power and efficiency, particularly at takeoff and transonic speeds. The improved engine would also include additional sound deadening. More importantly, extra power would eliminate the need for afterburners, a significant contributor to Concorde's heavy fuel consumption and takeoff noise. These were just a few of the improvements that would help to increase Concorde's operating economics while reducing noise. Early versions of Concorde had a range of just under 6,000 kilometers, barely enough to fly across the Atlantic and not enough to span the Pacific. The combination of limited range and overland flight restrictions made for an unappealing proposition for airlines, but Concorde B promised to boost range to 6,500 kilometers, a slight gain that could have made all the difference, because it would have connected the world's financial hubs, like Tokyo to Los Angeles with a refueling stop in Honolulu. Even with 2 45-minute refueling stops, a flight from Hong Kong to Los Angeles could be cut to just 8 hours on Concorde B, not the grueling 15.5 hours it takes today. An appealing alternative for business passengers that might have made purchasing Concordes more attractive for airlines. The first Concorde B would have been ready by 1982, but it never made it off the drawing board, largely due to lack of political will and funding. Whether or not Concorde B would have made a difference is, of course, at this point, entirely speculation.